Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. What does it mean to be a voice, and how do you find your voice? For my guest today, the process involved learning to navigate comfortably within two cultures. Her discoveries may help us think in new ways about how voices empower all of us. Hear about it today on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Nikki Toyama-Szeto, co-editor of More Than Serving Tea, an anthology exploring the intersection of race, gender, and spirituality for Asian American women. She's also associate director of the annual Urbana Mission Convention. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you.
As a teenager, you fought the stereotypes of your gender and your race. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I felt that my identity as an Asian American woman, a lot of people would assume different things about me. And there's, I think, something in me that sort of always tries to buck the trend. And so whenever people would ask, oh, we're playing ultimate frisbee, I was always one of the first people to just go out there and say, I want to play, or play touch football, just really put myself out there. And I think part of what I was trying to do is I just felt like I was put in a box as an Asian American woman. And I just wanted to do everything that I could to fight that.
To push out of the box?
To push out of that box, yeah.
How did the box get built? When did you start to hear those messages?
The first thing that I remember is I was a big, and still kind of am, if I'm honest, musical theater fan. And my friends and I, we used to sing Annie and Cats and all those things when we were little. But I remember Annie was coming through town and they were running auditions. And I told my friends, this is in the first grade, I said, I'm gonna audition for Annie. And they looked at me and they said, you can't audition for Annie. And that was my first racial realization of there is something about how I look. I think, I don't see my face often, but that's the main thing that everyone interacts with, and that there are different things that people assume about who I am. That was the first time that I interacted with something that's like, oh, people see something about me that I myself might not necessarily see.
And as you were growing up, what things were you taught were features of your personality because of the way you looked?
Yeah, well, I would always get praised for things like, oh, oh, she's so quiet, or oh, she's so obedient, or so it's like these little things that would kind of get reinforced. And then the look of surprise on people at different points would show me, oh, we didn't expect that of you. So kind of this quiet subservience, definitely. Sort of a meek and mild kind of, so if I did anything a little bit assertive, like that was sort of a surprise for people. If I was outspoken and I told funny jokes, I think people would kind of look at me quizzically, and then kind of, like once they knew who I was, it
made sense, but...
Yeah, but it's that first moments.
And you had to have that sort of double because you're female and because you're Asian.
That's right.
Yeah. In the movies, the Asian woman is either quiet and subservient, or she's the cruel dragon woman.
That's right. For a little while, I wasn't exactly sure how to interact with these stereotypes. So in the beginning, I started by just trying to act against the stereotypes. But the thing I began to realize is, as an Asian American woman, I think stereotyping is just going to be a part of my reality. So I began to learn that what I actually need to do is learn to navigate the stereotypes. As a Christian woman, I found that there's some ways that actually comes to my advantage. So,
you mean the fact that people have expectations and you're able to fulfill those expectations?
Or I'm able to debunk them.
Okay.
So for example, I used to work on campus at UC Berkeley. And at UC Berkeley, they eat Christians for lunch. I mean, it's just, you could say you're a mass murderer who raises porcupines, and they'll be like, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
But you say you're a Christian, and that just shuts everything down. So at lunchtime one day, we were trying to do some experimenting with having spiritual conversations with people on campus. And I was terrified to do this. But I went up to folks, and we were having these great spiritual conversations, and I was debriefing with someone at the end, another Asian American woman, and I said, that just sort of freaked me out. And she said, why? And I said, well, I didn't want to offend anybody. And then she said, Nikki, look at us. Who's going to be offended by us? She's another 5 foot tall, petite Asian woman. And I realized there's a way that I can get away with saying some things because of the stereotypes folks have of Asian women of being maybe harmless or demure. If I were a 6-foot-tall white man and I said the same things about a community, that they would be like, who are you? And that would automatically put people on the defensive. But because I'm smaller or because I look younger than I am, people can sometimes hear my words for what they are, even if they are sort of threatening words. So I think that's one area where some of that can come into play and actually be helpful.
You have written about being called cute and how sort of objectionable all that finally becomes, but you've also said that closes some doors, you're too little. And I remember the Mary Tyler Moore show years ago. Mary Tyler Moore goes in and the boss listens to her, Lou Grant, and finally he says, "You're perky." And she says, "Why, thank you." And he says, "I hate perky." Perky can be great. Perky can be a real obstacle. Cute can be an obstacle. Some of the women in this book have objected to be sort of dismissed as nice or as passive. Are there also Asian women who appreciate that and are comforted by not having to stand up in front of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the same way that anybody would be comforted by the stereotype or the perception, if that creates a space for them that they feel very comfortable with.
It helps you know your identity.
Yeah, it may do that. I think the thing that feels challenging though is, I know some very bossy, loud Asian women, and the thing that their conclusion that they come away with is, I don't feel Asian. And that's the thing that I don't want people to ever feel like. There's a generation of bossy Asian women, and they're the ones, there's like a woman, activist, Yuri Kochiyama, she worked with the Black Panthers. There's a legacy of bossy, loud Asian women, and I think I want people to feel freed up, to see that there's a fullness beyond the stereotypes, and they're fully Asian American in the midst of living out that. But where stereotypes, I think really for anyone, not just Asian American women, limit, that's where they become harmful.
I feel even uncomfortable in some of the questions I'm asking because I'm assuming stereotypes that I'd rather not. And yet there is kind of this, it's a complicated message because you're learning to live into some cultural expectations. That is, the stereotypes come from outside and they come from inside an Asian American culture.
Yeah, that's right.
And what you're trying to navigate, and the book works through this so well, is how can you be both Asian and yourself?
That's right.
Tell me about the family pressures that you felt growing up.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think is really interesting, because a lot of the gender stereotypes for Asian American women, they froze in time. So it's this, so when a lot of Koreans immigrated in the 70s, a lot of Japanese kind of in the 40s, 50s came over. And whenever the family came over into the United States, their concept of what a woman should be like froze in time. I mean, the Donna Reed, pearls, something. So, and then when the parents were raising their children here in the United States, their children were not growing up that way. They were becoming, they would call it Americanized. Right. But I think in reality what they didn't see was that gender roles back in the home country, they were actually evolving too. So the standard against which the little girls were being measured, it didn't even exist anymore. It was like a frozen in time in 1974 or whenever folks got on that plane or came on that boat. And so what it did is it created this really unrealistic expectation. And if you left this kind of 1950s or 1970s picture of what a woman should be like, you were labeled automatically Americanized without kind of understanding, actually, how people look, it totally has evolved and changed. So as a result, within Asian American families or with my community, there were only a couple of categories for what an Asian woman could be. She was sort of pure and innocent, or she was the dragon lady and a little loose, right? But that's very old-fashioned concepts for who women can be. That in the American context, it's really evolved since then. In Japan, the categories have really, really evolved. So I think there's a way that these family structures, maybe sort of for survival in the United States, maintained some of these perceptions and tried to pass it on to their children.
That's really interesting. The other thing that complicates this is that Asian cultures differ.
That's right. Yeah.
That we can talk about East Asian or South Asian, and they're not all the same. So the stereotypes imposed on you by Americans, longtime Americans, may not even fit what your culture used to be like.
That's exactly right. The term Asian American is actually kind of an artificial concept that came out of the 60s when the civil rights movement was happening, and Asians sort of needed to figure out what they were. So we're not united by a common language, a common history, some Confucian values for East Asians, but there's not a lot of similarities. Like Latin Americans are mostly united by a common language, different things like that. So I was in Starbucks the other day, and this little girl came up to me. She said, "Ni hao." Ni hao is Mandarin for hello. There's a real popular kids show called Ni hao Kailan. And I was debating whether or not to go into a sociological discourse about, well, actually, I'm Japanese American. It's just different from Chinese.
Yeah.
Decided to let it go and just said ni hao back.
Good. Talk about the difference. You write about the difference between a dyadic culture and an individualistic culture. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, a dyadic culture is a culture where a person looks to others outside of them to give them their identity or their definition. It's very similar actually to Jewish culture, which makes it in some ways like a half step for Asians when they're reading scripture to understand some of this. So for example, in a dyadic culture, and I'll say like in a Japanese American family, folks would say you're an oldest daughter. Oldest daughters are responsible for taking care of their parents. They're their parents' retirement plan. And so that would become part of my identity. Individualistic culture looks more for self-expression or internal discovery of self in order to, that's kind of the ultimate fulfillment. But the dyadic culture takes cues of who they are in this community as to form their identity.
So I might express my identity in terms of my career or where I live or how I look, and you might express your identity more in terms of your relationship to family or to...
I might express myself exactly the same way, but the question is, how did I come to what my career is, how do I look, all that sort of thing. So what my career is was maybe told to me. There's 20 doctors in our family, you will be a doctor. How I look, oh, you have earlobes that don't attach, that's unlucky. You have an unlucky look. So it might be all the exact same things that formulate what identity is, but it's just how did I arrive to the conclusions that I have in that.
I mean, so are you saying that your identity is formed more by what others are telling you about yourself than about what you discover about yourself? Or?
Yes, I think that would be part of it.
Okay.
I mean, for example, I had competing desires. I wanted to do really well in school, and this is not to perpetuate the stereotype that all Asians do well in school, but I personally wanted to do really well in school. And I noticed that I would get really bad grades on participation. So I thought, oh, sitting, being earnest, following directions, aren't those participation? And apparently not. I found out that I have to raise my hand and just say something. Anything. It didn't even have to contribute to the conversation. And that would raise my marks. I kind of learned to play the game, if you will. Yeah. And I felt very uncomfortable in certain ways where that clashed with some of the behaviors that were reinforced at home.
Right. But there is this sort of model minority image.
That's right.
That can really overwhelm and even devastate some Asian American women, that sometimes when you can't achieve what are impossible expectations, the suicide rate among Asian American women is very high, right?
That's right. On campus, in terms of mental health rates, I think Asian American men have the highest rates of depression on campus, and then Asian American women are, I don't know where they stand, but they're pretty close. The other thing that makes it really difficult is that Asian American culture does not reinforce airing dirty laundry. Asian American culture is very kind of tribal, and we sort of keep things within our family, and so it can be it's sort of a toxic combination to put together. There are great sides to Asian American culture. I would say that that's not one of the best sides.
So you can carry a lot of problems and you're not supposed to ask for help outside the family.
That's right. Or you're not supposed to tell someone that
you're having problems.
That I'm having problems, that this is breaking. I'm not able to keep up with my grades. I'm not going to make med school. Whatever these different, I mean, young adults are in a pressure cooker anyways.
Right.
So sometimes there's different overlays.
But I sense from reading that there's a difference between a culture that says, well, you did your best and that's enough, and a culture that says you did your best and it was flawed. Did you feel some of the latter growing up?
Oh yeah. This book came out of the fact that I was a campus minister on campus. And we dealt with a lot of Asian American folks, particularly women. And the chapters and the content that we came up with really came out of their stories. It was the different ways that we were counseling different women over and over about the same issues. And it seemed like some of these issues just had a strength or a passion behind them that we found surprising. And some of the perfectionistic tendencies, that was one of the things that really came out. I remember sitting and hearing stories of some of these young women at, very high achieving women. And all they could come away from a certain experience was the one thing that was wrong. I can tell a funny story about that. I was the bridesmaid at my sister's wedding, and my mother made the wedding dress. And my mother's a fashion designer, and she made the wedding dress. And as my sister went up to the front, and in the back of the wedding dress there was this crease. And I looked at that and I thought, my mom is probably just fixated on that one crease. And sure enough, after the wedding was over, first thing my mother said, "Did you see the crease on her? Did you not see the lights and trumpet volunteer being played and the flowers and the look on my sister's face?" As she was saying, all that kind of gets washed out.
And there are other messages that come, at least according to the book, that you grow up learning that every detail has to be perfect, that there are rules for how you stand and sit and serve tea, right? There's a traditional message that men are superior, right?
That's right.
Does that still come through?
Yes.
And why do mothers reinforce that stereotype? Why do Asian mothers reinforce to their daughters the idea that men are better?
Because worse than the idea that men are better is the fact that their daughter might never get married, and they might never have grandchildren. So that for some reason, that's like the ultimate failure on a mother's part for whatever reason. And so they're willing to pass on maybe some really bad advice in order that doesn't happen.
To make sure that you're appealing to a man.
That's exactly right. So things about, you shouldn't be too smart. Don't be too picky. Maybe you shouldn't take up that hobby because men might feel threatened by that. I mean, I don't know what it is. It'd be real interesting for me to understand symbolically, what does that mean that a daughter is married? How does that equal success, or what does that say? I'm sure there's some real interesting roots. I think one of the things in the process of writing the book is I began to have compassion for where some of these things come from. That it's not all, you kind of look at some of the facts, you go, oh, that's horrendous. But then when you look at some of the beginning parts of where this comes from, then you gain some sympathy.
Right.
So, like for example, with my mom and some perfectionistic tendencies, she was raised as an immigrant. She came over when she was 12 and came over on a boat 3 weeks by herself. My grandparents were already in the United States. And I think she was picked on a lot as a kid. And there were so many ways that she felt that she didn't belong. And so I think part of the expectation that she put on me, we call it second generation racism. She wanted to be a doctor in a medical emergency room. She was really good at math. But one of the things that she carried with her was the shame of wearing secondhand clothing week after week after week. So she went into fashion. But I think part of, as I was going through my schooling, that she just really fueled or was really proud, or there was something that I think gave her a validation. I belong here. My daughter, she went to a great school. She's succeeding in society. She's getting paid well. She has all these sort of trappings of success, and somehow it validates. So I think that was a hard thing to find, that some of these things that have a toxic effect, they actually have their root in something that actually wants our compassion.
Yeah, that's very well put. And again, I think that's not exclusive to Asian culture.
That's
I think
right.
many parents live through their children. You were an engineer.
That's right.
I think that when you wrote about rebelling as a teenager, and rebelling maybe is too strong a word, I think you said something to the effect that in doing so, you lost your voice.
Yes.
You had an experience talking with friends when an older woman asked you, when did you realize you are a voice? Mm-hmm. And you were sort of shocked by this because you hadn't realized you were, but you are. What does that mean to be a voice?
I used to think that being a voice meant being noisy and loud, being a charismatic personality. You'd walk in the room, everyone would turn, listen to you, and that you'd have presence and influence. That's what I thought being a voice was. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true, but that's not who I am. I tend to be curious. I tend to ask a lot of questions. I tend to like to gather data by observing and reading about things, or there's sort of a different way. But I began to realize that in the way that I asked questions, that I was influencing groups of people. It was the things that I saw and the questions that I asked. And I never had a category that was influence or having voice. And so I began to realize that there are different ways that people would listen to me and respond differently. And when this older woman kind of affirmed that in me, I took a different posture with that, and I realized this is something I need to steward. So then I began to pay attention to, okay, I need to own that I have a voice. So much of my identity, I thought, I don't have voice. But now I go, oh, I do have voice. So what does it mean for those, like, who now is not at the table, and how can I try to welcome their voice in? I think, yeah.
So part of what you mean when you say that you have a voice is that your voice empowers others.
That's right.
That's great. That's great.
The Philippines have this great proverb. It's called lifting as you climb. And what they exhort young people as they succeed to bring others with them. And I think that's a little bit of the image that I have in my mind. How can I lift as I climb?
Tell me some stories about ways that you've seen that happening.
I sit on the board of an organization called Missionaire, where we send young adults into urban centers to be a part of the community and to serve there and to learn about God's heart for the city, really. And sitting on the board has been very interesting, but I began to realize that there's an enormous amount of structural power that sits there. And we were having a conversation, and it was really a racialized conversation about some of the leadership, some strategy, some finances that were going on. And one of the things that I began to realize is I myself have been in so many situations where people did not understand me, but made decisions that totally affected my life. Mm-hmm. They had perceptions about who I was and just made decisions. So one of the things that I did before we went into this board meeting was I called a couple of other folks, mostly African Americans, because some of the dynamics we were talking about was a white African American dynamic. And I said to them, I said, what is something that you would want the board to know as we were making this decision? And I think trying to make an on-ramp for some of those voices to enter the conversation, even though at that point there was no other African American on our board, I just felt like it felt wrong to make a leadership decision that would affect this whole organization without having that voice. So I think tapping into my own experiences and what I wish someone had done for me, mm-hmm. that informs how it is that I lead in different situations.
Is there a way that that ability is shaped then by your Asian American upbringing? The book is called More Than Serving Tea, and several of the authors in there talk about redeeming the serving of tea, that's not something you have to give up, but it's taught you some things. What has it taught you?
Yeah, I think one of the things we're trying to do in the book is we didn't want people to just say, oh, Asian culture sucks, and this book tells me all the reasons why. We also wanted to say, God created culture. And there are things that he gave to Asian culture or Asian Americans to steward so that the rest of his family would know more about who he is. Mm-hmm. So there's certain things that Asian culture has easy access to of the character of God. And there are other things that I think are cultural things. Mm-hmm. make obstacles for understanding the true character of God. So we've talked mostly about some of the obstacles. But for example, serving tea as an image, it was sometimes an oppressive image. There's all these rules, at least in Japanese serving tea. You hold your wrist just so, you tip it this way, you turn the cup. There's all these rituals. But then if you look behind the rituals, there's so much of why they were designed to honor other folks. One of the authors, Kathy, tells a fantastic story about how at the passing, I think it was of her mother-in-law or her father-in-law, just the way the community knew how to step in and take care of her in her grief. And that was just a part and parcel of the culture, but it was something at that moment she was terribly grateful for. And I think that there's these different ways that these cultural systems, they really, really work, and they minister to people in ways that we wouldn't know how to ask.
So sometimes all the little rules are really not so much about the rules as they are about creating an atmosphere of hospitality.
That's right.
And that's what redeems it now.
That's right.
Great.
That's exactly right.
Thank you. My guest today has been Nikki Toyama-Szeto, co-editor of More Than Serving Tea, an anthology exploring the intersection of race, gender, and spirituality for Asian American women. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.